And that's the news tonight. Another British air attack on Port Stanley airfield. Almost 700 Argentines have now been rescued from the cruiser Belgrano. Mrs. Thatcher says she's sorry for any loss of life, but she defends the sinking. But there's growing concern about it at Westminster and in Europe. Good evening. British warplanes were in action over the Falkland Islands again today. They attacked the airfield at Port Stanley for the second time. But most attention here and throughout the world has been concentrated on the sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano and the fate of her crew. The latest word on that from official sources in Argentina is that 680 survivors of the 1,000-man crew have been picked up, and the search is going on for the other 300 or so. Many life rafts have been spotted in the area where the cruiser went down after being torpedoed by the British submarine HMS Conqueror. In the House of Commons, the government were pressed hard to give more exact details of the circumstances surrounding the attack, which happened outside the so-called total exclusion zone surrounding the Falklands. All Labour speakers were critical of the possibly high loss of life. More than 50 have signed a motion calling for a truce. The government is said to be worried at reaction from other countries too. But when Mrs. Thatcher answered questions in the House, she insisted that the attack had been fully justified.
That cruiser and associated destroyers, and of course there are other task forces of the Argentinian Navy also at large in the South Atlantic, not far from the exclusion zone, they do pose a very obvious threat to the men in our task force, and had we left it any later, it would have been too late. Then I might have had to have come to the House with the news that some of our ships had been sunk.
Despite that defence of the torpedoing of the General Belgrano, the sinking of the cruiser split the thin-spun unity at Westminster today. MPs were united in praising the skill and courage of the British task force, but the Falklands dispute had been transformed over the weekend from a war of words and a blockade into one with serious casualties.
Sorry to interrupt John Cole there, but we've just heard from the Ministry of Defence in London that they have a new statement on the Falklands crisis. We're going over there now.
To any questions, directly or indirectly. In the course of its duties within the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, HMS Sheffield, a Type 42 destroyer, was attacked and hit late this afternoon by an Argentine missile. The ship caught fire, which spread out of control. When there was no longer any hope of saving the ship's company abandoned ship. All who abandoned her were picked up. It is feared that there have been a number of casualties, but we have no details of them yet. Next of kin will be informed first as soon as details are received. Further air operations were also conducted over the Falkland Islands today. The Vulcan attack on Port Stanley airfield carried out this morning was successful, and the aircraft involved returned safely. In the course of Sea Harrier attacks, one of our aircraft was shot down. The pilot has been killed. His name will be announced after we have confirmation that his next of kin have been informed. All the other Sea Harriers returned safely. The task force is continuing with its operations as planned. A statement will be made in the House of Commons tomorrow when further details are known. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, that announcement is going to come as a devastating blow to the task force commander and to the Navy, and indeed to Mrs. Thatcher. The loss of HMS Sheffield, which is one of our newest ships in the fleet, a Type 42, is an astonishing loss to have to admit. It's likely she was hit by an Exocet missile, which is a very dangerous type of weapon, and yes, as the statement said, the fire spread beyond control. As a result of that, the ship had to be abandoned, and undoubtedly there have been quite considerable casualties. The loss of the Sea Harrier is one of those tragedies which happens when fast jets attack troops dug into defensive positions. Ever since they were raided at Goose Green in the Falklands last Sunday, the Argentines will have been preparing for this kind of attack. The Argentines have good anti-aircraft defences, and they were probably waiting for the jets when it came in. And what probably happened was that the gunners anticipated the angle of attack by the Harrier and opened fire. But the loss of a Sea Harrier is one thing, the loss of a major warship very much another, and it must throw into doubt the whole future of the task force expedition and call into question the timing of any landing and anything else on the Falklands. Now back to John Humphreys.
Christopher Wayne, and of course if we get any more developments on that particularly grave incident, we will be bringing them to you during the course of the programme. But now some diplomatic reaction to the sinking of the General Belgrano. From a diplomatic point of view, the sinking of a capital warship with the inherent risk of loss of life is likely to affect the view that other countries take of Britain's stand on the Falklands issue. The reaction of the Soviet Union was predictable enough, as was that of the Latin American countries. But some European allies are showing signs of unwillingness to continue active support for Britain. And of course, there's Ireland's call for a UN Security Council debate. But what of our most powerful and influential ally? From Washington, here's Martin Bell.
The Americans haven't yet been urging the British to ease up on hostilities, but they are extremely concerned about the effect of the sinking of the cruiser on Latin American opinion. Mr. Haig is known to believe that it will create a climate of ill will and make negotiation all the more difficult, to which the British reply that negotiations weren't getting anywhere anyway. The Secretary of State was testifying today on Capitol Hill, and he blamed Argentina for the continuing failure of diplomatic initiatives.
One could readily draw the conclusion that the recent tragic loss of lives associated with the loss of their cruiser has contributed to this continuing intransigence, if you will.
As for political opinion, today for the first time the dispute came to the floor of one of the houses of Congress, and the Belgrano wasn't even mentioned.
Our nation has no choice but to stand firmly beside the United Kingdom against aggression. They have been a historical ally, and we must not turn our backs on them.
Given the support which we've received from Great Britain in a whole series of international crises, from World War II through the hostage crisis in Iran, that the very least we could do was to stand by our British friends at this very difficult moment for them.
An administration spokesman said the United States regretted the loss of life on the Belgrano, which pointed up the absolute necessity of reaching a political settlement. In official circles, there's anxiety, but no condemnation of Britain, and among the public at large, so far as one can judge it, a feeling that the British have got away with it. In fighting back, they've done what they said they'd do, and maybe a little bit more.
Whitehall is concerned at world reaction, and while before the sinking of the cruiser the attitude was let the Argentines stew for a bit, there is now a feeling that to avoid any major eroding of support for Britain's case, this affair may have to be brought up to a head sooner than had been planned, and the loss of HMS Sheffield would obviously confirm that view. There are already cracks appearing in the support from Britain's EEC partners. EEC sanctions against Argentina are the cornerstone of the economic arm of Britain's campaign to get the Falklands back. They're due for renewal in 2 weeks' time, but after a meeting of the Irish cabinet, a statement said they would seek an end to sanctions because they were no longer appropriate. Dublin also called for a meeting of the United Nations Security Council to call for a ceasefire, a move that would be opposed by Britain. And the Irish Defence Minister said his government now regarded Britain as the aggressor. Whitehall sources were quick to point out that Ireland has an interest in portraying Britain as a colonialist aggressor, and the Irish government quickly announced that the Defence Minister's view was his own. Irish Prime Minister Charles O'Keefe has been clarifying his government's position.
I'd like to think that what we're doing today is trying to help both Britain and Argentina. We think this is an appalling situation which has developed to a very dangerous level, and it's up to us as a member of the Security Council and as a peace-loving nation dedicated to solving international disputes through the UN in a peaceful way, that it's up to us to help both Britain and the Argentine. So there's no question of being for one or for the other. It's a trying to, the only thing we're for is peace and saving lives and stopping war.
There had been suggestions earlier in the day that other EEC members might be having second thoughts about backing Britain. The French government viewed the sinking with consternation and said it would complicate a diplomatic solution. The Danes described it as tragic. West Germany called for a ceasefire. The Italians were said to be worried about supporting Britain if the violence escalated. And the president of the EEC's Council of Ministers, Gaston Thorn, said such war incidents made finding a solution more difficult. And so Britain's senior common market civil servants used a routine meeting in Brussels this evening to try and hold support and assure their colleagues that diplomatic channels were still open. They appear at least to have staved off a split. Mr. Tindemans, the Belgian Prime Minister, said tonight that there will be a further and intensive discussion when the EEC foreign ministers meet in Belgium at the weekend. They'll be trying to open up new diplomatic channels and trying to come up with a new negotiator to replace American Secretary of State Haig. Other world reaction has been pretty predictable, with the South American nations condemning Britain. Russian leader Mr. Brezhnev has made his first comment on the crisis, a relatively mild attack on Britain. The Kremlin would love to attack the Iron Lady, Mrs. Thatcher, but can't really support a right-wing military dictatorship, however much it wants grain and meat. Another relatively mild reaction has come from a very unexpected quarter, Argentine Foreign Minister Costa Mendes.
I think that this fact, this event, will have a tremendous impact in world opinion, and I think that it will, in spite of its terribly negative consequences from a human point of view, I think that they will, in a way, ease the way to peace.
We hope to be carrying a full interview with Mr. Costa Mendes on Newsnight on BBC2 later tonight. He was presumably referring to the flurry of diplomatic activity since the sinking. The Americans say they're still working actively on the problem. They seem to be backing a Peruvian plan. And there's a new United Nations plan in the wind. Secretary General de Cuellar has put certain ideas to London and Buenos Aires, and he's said to have sought urgent reaction to them. And after the news of the sinking of HMS Sheffield, he'll undoubtedly get that urgent reaction. The problem is that while no one has doubted that the diplomatic route to a solution has always been open, no one has any idea how to chart a path along it.
Argentina has been continuing the search in the South Atlantic for survivors from the cruiser General Belgrano. The Argentine military authorities say 680 sailors have now been rescued, but others, perhaps as many as several hundred, are still missing. 15 ships have been searching for life rafts all day. But reaction in Argentina to the sinking of the cruiser by a British submarine has been one of outrage, as Michael Burke reports.
Until now, censorship has meant the Argentine people have heard only of victory. But there's been no attempt to cover up the sinking of the General Belgrano, and no doubt of the sense of shock it's produced here. One newspaper headline says just 2 words: English murderers. Another calls Mrs. Thatcher a crazy killer who can be compared only with Hitler. One of the last known pictures of the General Belgrano with its Argentine crew. They lined up on the deck in ceremonial order. This peacetime complement was 700 men, but when she was torpedoed, she had a wartime crew of over 1,000. The government has been reassuring the people that the loss of the General Belgrano will not significantly reduce the strength of the Argentine fleet. Pictures released here, apparently taken during a recent training exercise, stress the firepower of the aircraft carrier and Argentina's more modern warships. The film was prepared before the cruiser was torpedoed, and even though it was the second largest ship in the fleet, it was not even mentioned. The present location of the Argentine fleet is unknown. It's merely said to be somewhere in the South Atlantic. But so far, only these patrol boats are being used to try to get through to the Falklands. Today, Argentine newspapers have called on their fleet to attack the British task force. In the next few hours, one editorial said, the aggressors will realize they're not only fighting the armed forces, but a whole country supported by an entire continent. Argentina's military strategists say the Belgrano was old and a relatively easy target. Their modern ships, armed with missiles, are a more formidable proposition. What little room and what little desire there was here for compromise now seems to have disappeared. As reports came in today of fresh fighting, the national mood has become increasingly belligerent. The government called the sinking of the General Belgrano an uncalled for act of aggression, and the people are outraged.
Now back to John Cole for his report on political reactions here at home to the sinking of the Belgrano.
Well, even before tonight's tragic news from the Ministry of Defence, the sinking of the Argentine cruiser had split Westminster's unity today. MPs were united in praising the skill and courage of the British task force, but the Falklands dispute had been transformed over the weekend from a war of words and of blockade into one with serious casualties. It was Labour MPs who sounded most uneasy about this in the House, but privately some Conservatives are beginning to lose hope that the government's diplomatic efforts will succeed before there's more bloodshed, and tonight they've had tragic confirmation of that. Dennis Healy, Labour's deputy leader, pressed both Francis Pym, the Foreign Secretary, and John Knott, the Defence Secretary, on this.
There is deep concern on our side of the House and among many of our allies in case certain types of military action, and I think that the attack on the cruiser General Belgrano may be an instance of this, intended, as the Right Honourable Gentleman said, to back up negotiation, may weaken or even destroy the possibility of negotiations for a long-term solution. And he must be aware, from telegrams he's received in the Foreign Office this morning, that the operations of the last few days have already cost us a great deal of support among our European allies.
Mr. Pym made some reference to Peruvian efforts at peacemaking without arousing too much hope. The government's at pains tonight to make clear that it's still trying for peace through Lima, Washington and the UN in New York. Many MPs the inner cabinet's been meeting again this evening to put flesh on negotiating ideas, and many MPs were depressed by reports that Britain's international support might be slipping. Labour pressed for more information about the sinking of the Argentine cruiser, but Mr. Knott insisted that the House must not put the task force at risk.
The action did take place, we believe, just outside, 35 miles outside the total exclusion zone. But as I told the House, the cruiser and its escorting destroyers were in fact only hours steaming time away. The Right Honourable Gentleman asked me the precise distance. I cannot give that to the House because I am not prepared to reveal the position of our task force.
The political atmosphere is certain to become even more tense over the next month. The government today named the 27th of May as the date for the Beaconsfield by-election, and Labour has chosen to have the Merton and Morden contest a week later. Both campaigns are certain to be dominated by what happened 7,000 miles away in the Falklands.
And here once again is how we heard from the Ministry of Defence, just as we were going on the air, of Britain's first serious losses in the Falklands conflict. The loss of the destroyer HMS Sheffield and a Sea Harrier.
In the course of its duties within the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, HMS Sheffield, a Type 42 destroyer, was attacked and hit late this afternoon by an Argentine missile. The ship caught fire, which spread out of control. When there was no longer any hope of saving the ship's company abandoned ship. All who abandoned her were picked up. It is feared that there have been a number of casualties, but we have no details of them yet. Next of kin will be informed first as soon as details are received. Further air operations were also conducted over the Falkland Islands today. The Vulcan attack on Port Stanley airfield carried out this morning was successful, and the aircraft involved returned safely. In the course of Sea Harrier attacks, one of our aircraft was shot down. The pilot has been killed. His name will be announced after we have confirmation that his next of kin have been informed. All the other Sea Harriers returned safely. The task force is continuing with its operations as planned. A statement will be made in the House of Commons tomorrow when further details are known.
HMS Sheffield had a ship's company of 270 officers and men. She was a Type 42 destroyer and was reckoned to be one of the most modern warships in the Royal Navy. It's quite possible that it was one of her Lynx helicopters which sank the Argentine tug near the same spot 2 nights ago. If so, the Argentine Navy have taken massive revenge. In naval terms, it more than offsets the loss of the cruiser General Belgrano, and in human terms, it's possible that the casualties may be high. HMS Sheffield, seen here off Gibraltar, was commissioned 7 years ago. When she was hit, she was probably manoeuvring at full speed. Under those circumstances, fire is extremely dangerous, and it spreads rapidly because it's forced through the ship from the rush of air. Of course, all the crew would have been closed up at action stations, watertight doors would have been closed, and the crew would have been wearing anti-flash clothing. But modern anti-ship missiles are designed to knock out a ship at a single blow, and that's what happened today.
And the Sheffield was, in fact, the first surface ship to be commanded by Admiral Sandy Woodward, the task force commander. The luxury liner, the QE2, is now being prepared to carry more troops to the Falklands. She was requisitioned yesterday and will transport over 3,000 infantrymen. The QE2 docked at Southampton at midnight last night from New York.
From the moment that QE2 docked in Southampton at midnight last night, she was under the orders of the Ministry of Defence. Technically, she became government property as the last of the passengers had stepped ashore this morning after their transatlantic crossing from Philadelphia. The passengers certainly hadn't been expecting the captain's announcement in mid-voyage.
I was a little surprised, and I'm disappointed for the future people who are going to enjoy the cruise. But of course, if it's necessary, it's necessary. I hope to go kick the hell out of those bastards. Possibility.
Aboard the QE2, meetings went on all day between Cunard directors and Ministry of Defence officials to decide how the ship needed modifying for service as a troop carrier. Already some fittings have been brought ashore and supplies taken on board. Normally, the luxury cruise liner would be getting ready to cater for up to 1,800 people, but of course that's for holiday-style accommodation. Judicious use of the 1,000 cabins and the recreation rooms could provide accommodation for 15,000 troops. During the Second World War, the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth carried 18,000 troops. There was a well-known 3-shift sleeping system with the claim that the beds never went cold. Meanwhile, some patriotism alongside the QE2 from members of a generation for whom, until now, war existed only in history books.
The propaganda war continues. BBC programmes in Spanish to Latin America were jammed again today. 3 sources of the jamming have been identified: Rosario and Cordoba, west of Buenos Aires, and San Salvador de Jujuy, close to the Chile-Bolivian border. Argentines, who rely largely on their television programs to find out what's happening on the Falklands, will be getting a slightly rosier view of events than they might get from other sources. Over pictures which give every impression of being filmed some time ago, an Argentine reporter has been describing how the attitude of the Falklanders has changed since Britain began what he called its bellicose action. People are very disappointed at the British, he says, because they're not interested in safeguarding the lives and property of the islanders. They see that the islands are in Argentine hands forever, he goes on, and they're re-evaluating their assessment of the Argentines. For example, instead of communicating with us in English, they have today begun to talk to us in Spanish. The Pope still plans to come to Britain later this month, despite everything. There had been speculation that the visit, starting on May the 28th, would be postponed or cancelled. But Catholic Church authorities say the Vatican has reaffirmed that it's still on, and there's even speculation that the Pope might offer himself as a mediator in the Falklands crisis. Other news tonight, another policeman has been murdered by gunmen in Londonderry. 50 people have been injured in a train crash in Scotland, and Co and Ovet will meet on the track 3 times this year. The Polish military government has imposed fresh security restrictions following yesterday's nationwide street clashes between police and supporters of the Solidarity Union. In Warsaw and other cities, the night curfew has been reimposed, the telephone service suspended, and student clubs and discos shut. Fresh rioting was reported today in the Baltic port of Szczecin, for long a stronghold of Solidarity. The Interior Minister, General Kitschak, said nearly 1,400 people had been arrested and would be tried under military law. In Northern Ireland, a provisional IRA attack in Londonderry has left a young policeman dead and a teenage policewoman seriously injured. The dead man was Police Constable Alan Caskey, who was 21. This morning he was part of a routine foot patrol in one of Londonderry's main shopping areas, the Diamond, when 3 gunmen struck. They leapt from a van hijacked earlier and opened fire at close range. Police Constable Caskey died almost instantly. The woman constable, who's 19, has been having emergency surgery. A 3rd policeman with the patrol was unhurt. He was taking a statement inside one of the shops. More than 50 people were hurt in a rail accident near Perth when the engine and 7 coaches of a Glasgow to Aberdeen passenger train were derailed. They toppled down a 30-foot embankment near a junction. 4 of those hurt had serious injuries. It's believed that the train hit a tractor on a farm crossing. The Manpower Services Commission has come up with a comprehensive youth training scheme for school leavers. It goes beyond the one already outlined by the Employment Secretary, Mr. Tebbit, and the Commission hopes to introduce it in the autumn of next year. A report by our Labour correspondent, Martin Adeney.
Today's plan would replace the 6-month Youth Opportunities Scheme, which has been criticised for sometimes being cheap labour. Instead, every 16 and 17-year-old leaving school would be guaranteed a year's work with a minimum of 13 weeks training. Underused employers' training workshops would be brought into use, and big firms paid a fee as managing agents to provide training for smaller establishments. Youngsters would be paid £25 a week. That's more than the £15 Mr. Tebbit suggested and was bitterly attacked by the unions. Yet the overall costs will be the same. So how does the finance work?
It's a balance of sacrifice in the sense that it will cost an employer perhaps £3,000 to train a young trainee, and all he'll get from government is either £1,850 or £1,950 if he's a managing agent. But on the other hand, the young man can work during his time he's there, and therefore the employer will get some productive use out of the trainee.
Mr. Tebbit is expected to decide next month, but Mr. Young said today he was optimistic he'd say yes.
Now back to tonight's dramatic news from the South Atlantic, the loss of the destroyer Sheffield and a Sea Harrier. Over now to Nicholas Witchell at the Ministry of Defence in London.
I understand that HMS Sheffield has now sunk. She was struck, I gather, by an air-to-ship missile during engagement with Argentine aeroplanes this afternoon. It was a direct hit on the ship's control room. HMS Sheffield was one of the latest guided missile Type 42 destroyers launched in June 1971. She had a complement of 270 men and was based in Portsmouth. HMS Sheffield was already at sea when the Falklands crisis started. She was diverted to the South Atlantic. There is no indication yet here at the Ministry of Defence about the number of casualties, but to recap on what the Ministry spokesman said a few moments ago, all those who abandoned her were picked up, but it is feared that there have been a number of casualties. From a very, very sombre Ministry of Defence in Whitehall, back now to the studio.
Mrs. Thatcher was given the news about 2 hours ago. She was in her room at the House of Commons. She immediately called in her inner cabinet. There is unlikely to be any official government comment tonight. Mrs. Thatcher is said by one common source who has seen her to be devastated by the news. Though, said the source, it was realized all along that this could be the price that would have to be paid. A Foreign Office comment was only that the search for a diplomatic solution will continue. It will no doubt now...